Okay. So before I ask you this next question, I want to go over some of the stuff that we talked about at the end of last week. Okay. So at the end of last week, we finished up talking about our different types of receptors related to our autonomic nervous system. So we're talking about cholinergic receptors, adrenergic receptors. Looks like at least most people, I think possibly all of you, the quiz on the stuff was not visible, which is actually great news because that means that we can have a longer kind of practice quiz time after having some of this information digest today and over the next days. Basically what I'm telling you is I'll put up some combination of like worksheets and quizzes so that you can make up those points, but like test your knowledge of some of this autonomic nervous system content that we're finishing up with. Okay, so expect to see that actually be visible after class. Yep. But we're talking about receptors. We have lots of different types. So a way that we might be practicing this, one of the main types we talked about, the more complicated type, was our adrenergic receptors, which are responding to epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are exclusively released as part of our sympathetic nervous system from either those postganglionic cells or from the chromaffin cells in the adrenal medulla. So we had a big table showing us how we can tell those types apart. I'm going to kind of summarize what I think we might be able to do with that table before I ask you a question, describing one and asking you to tell me which one it is. All right. So for our adrenergic receptors, adrenergic. Okay. We have a number of receptor types, specifically 5 of them divided into alpha and beta. 5 types. Okay. So we got alpha 1, alpha 2, and then 3 betas. So beta 1, beta 2, beta 3. Okay. So they're all responding to some degree to our sympathetic neurohormones, essentially. So they're going to be responding to epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are released by the postganglionic neurons in our sympathetic nervous system. But they have different affinities. So they like different hormones more than others, different neurotransmitters more than others. So for those affinities, what we're looking for is, does that receptor respond more to norepinephrine, more to epinephrine, or does it not care? So when we're going down here, one of the ways we can recognize alpha receptors is that they prefer norepinephrine. So if you see a receptor that's particularly receptive to norepinephrine, as opposed to epinephrine, you got an alpha receptor. So that's going to be true for both alpha 1 and alpha 2. Whereas when we're talking about those beta receptors, right, they're not going to prefer norepinephrine. 2 of them don't care, B1 and B3. Right, so for beta 1 or beta 2 receptors, sorry, beta 1 or beta 3 receptors, they're equivalently responsive to norepinephrine and epinephrine. But if we've got a beta 2 receptor, it's highly responsive to epinephrine specifically. Okay. Other things that we might be looking at to tell apart these adrenergic receptors would be the signal transduction inside the cell. So like those second messengers. Okay, so signal transduction. One of the big things we're looking for there, if we're looking inside the cell, so this is going to help us tell those alpha and beta receptors apart, because all three of those beta receptors are going to activate our cyclic A&P system. So activate cyclic A&P. Whereas our alpha receptors work in different ways. So our alpha 2 receptor inhibits cyclic A&P. And our alpha 1 receptor involves just an entirely different molecular mechanism. So it's going to activate IP3. Finally, we might look at the effect on the organ. So when I say that, right now we're just thinking, is it excitatory or inhibitory? Okay. And everything except for those beta 2 receptors on the whole is going to have an excitatory effect. Beta 2 receptors alone are going to be primarily inhibitory. So all the other threes, or all the other beta receptors, beta 3, beta 1, excitatory. And same for those alpha receptors, all on the whole excitatory. So these are some things that we know about these different types of the receptors. So now I will switch us over to our question. And this is just me copying down from that table you have in your book and in your slides a couple places. I'm just kind of walking you through how we're looking at it. Back. So if I tell you that we're looking at some receptor, back in, oops, no. Okay, it's going real quick. Okay, some receptor that has a high affinity for epinephrine, creates inhibitory effects in blood vessels due to its activation of the second messenger cyclic A&P. What type of receptor would we be talking about? Okay, take another couple seconds. Okay, great. that's that beta-2 receptor, activates cyclic AMP. It's the one that has inhibitory effects and high affinity for epinephrine. But using that table and that information in it, we could be able to pick out some of these other types of receptors if we wanted to do so. And in future units, as we talk about different organ systems, it's all kind of blah and boring when you see it in table form. But when we get to thinking about why does blood flow go to specific organs under specific conditions? Why do we see a different response in one part of the body versus another part of the body? It becomes important to understand these receptors because you're going to have different receptors available in different places in your body in different amounts. And that's going to create the big effect of how your body operates as a whole. So this is some of the baseline for how we build up to understanding, okay, why is our cardiac muscle doing that? Why is our vascular muscle doing that? Why are our pupils doing what they're doing under different conditions? And when you eventually, potentially in your future, talk about different types of drugs and their effects, many of them do affect different types of nerves. So this is a table specifically of drugs that affect the autonomic nervous system. And it's telling you their mechanism of action. Mechanism of action just means how it works. So you can see some of those receptors listed right in here in the mechanism of action. So you can see affecting alpha receptors here, some beta receptors here. We see this word muscarinic here, right? Our muscarinic cholinergic receptors were one of the types of cholinergic receptors we talk about. So for pharmacology, this is important to understand because this is how drugs work often. We target specific receptors, make them behave differently, and that creates changes in your body. Okay. So rounding out our autonomic nervous system, I'm just going to take a quick peek at how those nerves physically touch their effector organisms. So we're going to be looking at the synapse between the effector organs of the autonomic nervous system and those efferent nerves from the peripheral nervous system, from the autonomic nervous system, from the two branches, how they get there and how they actually have an effect on the effector organ. All right, so the neuroeffector junction just refers to that synapse between the nerve, the neuron, and the effector organ. So here we see the postganglionic neuron coming in. Right, so we would have a preganglionic neuron synapsing with a postganglionic neuron. Now we're looking at the postganglionic neuron, and we can see that this postganglionic neuron looks a little different than some of the nerves we've seen before. Okay. So usually at the end of our neuron, right, we have dendrites and the soma. Up here, we have that axon hillock, the axon. Cool, we still have an axon. But now instead of having those axon terminals, we've got these weird little spaghetti finger things. Okay. So these are still basically the endpoints of our nerves here for our autonomic neurons. But we have multiple places that we can be releasing those neurotransmitters, essentially. So these swellings, these varicosities, right? These varicosities are where we are storing those neurotransmitters, right? So depending on which branch of our autonomic nervous system we're talking about, we might be talking about acetylcholine if we're thinking parasympathetics. We might be talking about norepinephrine if we're thinking about sympathetics, but they're there in those synaptic vesicles, just like we saw in our previous unit. We have voltage-gated calcium channels ready to let us release those neurotransmitters stored in those synaptic vesicles. But now instead of just having them at those axon terminals at the endpoints, we have them throughout sort of a bigger stretch of space in these varicosities. Okay. They're still going to get released, just basically under the same types of conditions as we saw before. So we'll have an action potential coming down the axon, getting to those varicosities, which is when we will then see the release of these neurotransmitters. So just really the shape of what this looks like is the biggest difference here. Okay. So this diagram should look quite a lot like our understanding of the synapse was when we first saw it in our last unit, where we were mostly thinking about the central nervous system in the brain, even if we didn't always explicitly say that. Okay. So at the neuroeffector junction, we have our action potential coming down. And it's getting here now to a varicosity, right? So it's got to a varicosity. An action potential is a membrane depolarization, right? So that wave of depolarization is getting to the varicosity. So that's essentially a change in voltage. So it triggers those voltage-gated calcium channels, just like we saw in the synapse. Calcium comes into the varicosity, just like we saw at the synapse. So again, we just have that docking and release of the neurotransmitter from those vesicles. So that's just the same thing as saying exocytosis here. We're releasing it from the cell here at the varicosity. On the opposite side of this, on the effector cell side, so think like smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, we're not being specific yet, gland, right? So that neurotransmitter is now here on the surface of that effector organ, and it's going to bind into a receptor. So in this image I'm tracing through right now, we are looking at a postganglionic neuron releasing acetylcholine. So I'm going to pause, and before I tell you, you should be able to predict then which part of the autonomic nervous system this is. I didn't add a question slide, sorry. But because we have acetylcholine release from a postganglionic neuron, this means we're looking at parasympathetic innervation. That's because our sympathetic nervous system would only have acetylcholine released from the preganglionic neuron. So just from that label, we can tell, right? So we see that acetylcholine binding into a muscarinic cholinergic receptor, which is what we see on effector organs from the parasympathetic nervous system, right? Muscarinic cholinergic receptor involves a G protein. It's G protein coupled. Eventually, that G protein creates a response somewhere in this effector organ. Okay, so here we can see it's getting amplified. It's doing stuff in this cell. We're not being specific because we haven't been specific about what cell, what organ this is. But eventually, that neurotransmitter is either going to get degraded and taken away, or we're going to reuptake some or all of that neurotransmitter back into the varicosity. You can see the same thing happening in the image on the right, but we're looking at a different part of the nervous system. So in this case, we're looking at norepinephrine release from a postganglionic neuron. So we can tell it is part of the sympathetic nervous system. Same thing is happening here, right? We have an action potential coming down. That's a wave of depolarization. Means it's a change in voltage, which triggers that opening of the voltage-gated calcium channel. Calcium comes in. So those vesicles in the varicosities get triggered to release their neurotransmitter. In this case, they are received by an adrenergic receptor because that neurotransmitter was norepinephrine. If we knew what cell type, what type of receptor beyond just adrenergic, we could be more specific about exactly what's going on. We're not being specific right here. So we're just going to note that norepinephrine is going away as it's being taken back up into the cell. Okay. So this is just the same thing as what was happening in the synapse, but with different parts, right? Now, instead of a neuron to neuron connection, we're looking at a neuron to effector organ connection. And instead of an axon terminal, we have a varicosity here involved. These are some checkpoint questions you can use to review on your own later. We're going to take a little last summary of our autonomic function, right? So when we regulate autonomic function, we know that we have dual innervation of those organs by both the sympathetics and the parasympathetics. So we've got to have a balance between parasympathetics, which are our rest and digest part of the nervous system, the sympathetics, which are excitation, they're that fight or flight response. Okay. So whenever we see basically a resting state, right, we want to think of it as an increase in parasympathetic activity, but it's not going to be just like parasympathetic activity on, sympathetic off. It's all about sort of trade-offs. So there's going to be an increase in parasympathetic activity, and there's going to be a decrease in sympathetic activity, but it won't go all the way to zero, okay? Same thing in the reverse. In those stress, fight, or flight situations, you'll see an increase in sympathetic activity coupled to a decrease, but not to zero, of that parasympathetic activity. So one reflex response that controls your blood pressure when you stand up is actually coming from your autonomic nervous system, right? So it's important that it's automatic. So when you stand up, gravity actually pulls your blood down, pulls your blood towards your feet. So your blood physically starts to kind of pool down towards your feet and lower limbs. This means that a lot of your arteries are experiencing a drop in blood pressure, right? If we're measuring blood pressure, your neck, around your heart rate, and all of a sudden the blood is pooling near your feet, this would create a drop in some really important parts of your body. Okay? So your autonomic nervous system is part of what helps you immediately control that. So you have receptors that detect that decrease in blood pressure. You have an afferent pathway, so a sensory pathway going into your central nervous system telling you that there's been a drop in blood pressure. And the way it tells you happens to be it was firing action potentials, telling you that there's blood pressure. It starts to slow down those action potentials. That means there's less blood pressure. Your brain knows how to interpret that slowing of action potentials and figure out, this means my blood pressure is dropping. Yeah. So that's the integration piece of this homeostasis. Okay. So once that cardiovascular control center, and specifically your medulla oblongata in your brainstem, senses that drop in blood pressure, it's going to send out signals through the efferent pathways, those motor pathways, efferent meaning out. It's going to send out signals to your sympathetic nervous system and your parasympathetic nervous system. Right? What it's going to be saying is it's going to tell you to increase the sympathetic activity and decrease the parasympathetic activity. So as we increase the sympathetic activity in response to this drop in blood pressure, it's going to cause everything to kind of like tighten up. And this has the effect of raising your blood pressure back up. In order to have that overall sympathetic activity take effect, you had to decrease the parasympathetic activity a little bit at the same time. All right. So together, these effects on your heart and blood vessels from these parts of our autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches, raises the blood pressure back up. You no longer sense this drop in blood pressure, turning that signal off. So this is a negative feedback loop. All right, so that's the big picture of how this dual innervation stuff would work and this regulatory control would work. This is just a summary slide of when you're going to expect to see each of these. We will see the influence of the parasympathetic nervous system, as well as the influence of the sympathetic nervous system throughout our unit. So we'll talk about what are the parasympathetic effects, what are the sympathetic effects when we talk about the heart, when we talk about digestion, when we talk about breathing. So we'll see these coming back again multiple times as we talk about regulation of different states in your body. So parasympathetic activity, rest and digest, quiet, relaxed, lots of gastrointestinal stuff going on. Sympathetic activity, you're preparing to run away or to fight something. You're going to see increasing heart rates, increases in blood pressure. You're going to see mobilization of energy stores. So you're going to start feeding all your cells tons of glucose so that they have lots of energy in order to run away from something. You're going to see differences in pupils. You're going to see basically your gastrointestinal system and your urinary function decreasing there so you don't pee or poop yourself while you run away, basically. Good. Cool. So tonic activity just refers to, again, this sort of dual innervation piece. At rest, both branches are active because we have this dual innervation, but at rest, when your body's at rest, parasympathetic nervous system is in charge. Okay. And here are just some of those central nervous system regions that are involved with regulating this autonomic function. So you don't need to memorize this bit now, but you can see some of those regions of the brain that we've seen in lab are linked to this autonomic function that we've been discussing. And here are some big picture effects. We'll talk about many of these as we go through these different units. All of these will be different units that we'll be talking about. You can see it's linked to organs, linked to effects, even shows you what receptors are going to be involved here. So we're going to move forward into our endocrine system next. So our endocrine system is basically the system that's concerned with hormones. So we're going to be thinking about glands that produce hormones, and we're going to be thinking about specific hormones and what they do here. And we're going to start out by thinking about where the hormones are coming from, and we're going to dive in deep on some of them. So when we're thinking about hormones, mostly we think about them coming from endocrine glands. Okay, so an endocrine gland, something derived from epithelial tissue. So epithelial tissue is like linings, like your skin, right? But it's its own type of tissue that secretes stuff. So it makes stuff and then puts it out into your bloodstream. Endocrine signaling really has to do with the fact that you're sending a signal from that local gland place to somewhere far away, right? So endocrine signaling means that we really are kind of going to be involving the bloodstream here to send these signals throughout the body, okay? Now, some things in your body really only have endocrine function. That's their primary goal. Some unexpected parts of your body also do produce hormones and have some glandular tissue within them. But if I named those other parts of your body to you, you would not first guess that that is an endocrine organ, right? So we're going to separate out our endocrine organs into primary endocrine organs, where that hormone secretion, that's the main thing they do, okay? And secondary endocrine organs, where they do make a hormone, but their main job is something else, okay? All right, so looking at this list, just word recognition level here. So you've seen some primary endocrine glands in lab already. So this list, all of these are primary endocrine glands. This is our list of primary endocrine glands. I just want you to look through that list and think about, what do you know basically where it is, or what has been on your lab list so far? Right. Click through, 'cause this is just orienting us for where we are. Perfect. Yeah, so we saw in lab that the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, we saw those in our mid-sagittal brain section. So either in those liquidy brain sections that we had in the lab or on the model. Saw that hypothalamus below the thalamus, leading into an infundibulum, and the pituitary gland, which sits in the sella turcica on your skull. So those are going to be two of our primary endocrine glands that we will talk about in this unit. And we will be talking about other ones. So we'll also see our adrenal glands again, in addition to being involved with your sympathetic nervous system. They also have primary endocrine function. Your thyroid gland, your pineal gland, your pancreas and gonads are also primary endocrine organs. So primary endocrine organs are ones that their main job is to produce hormones. So hypothalamus and pituitary really going to be the most important ones, at least at first for us, okay? But all of these other glands, their main job, produce hormones. Tell them apart from secondary or endocrine organs by looking at that secondary endocrine organ list, right? So these are your secondary endocrine organs for things like the heart, right? The heart actually does produce a hormone called A&P, atrial natriuretic peptide, but you wouldn't say that's the main job of the heart, right? The main job of the heart is to pump blood, not to produce this hormone, which is why it's a secondary endocrine organ. Same thing for the kidneys. They're going to produce erythropoietin, which is a hormone that tells your body to make more blood cells, essentially, but their main job is to filter blood. Your GI tract, its main job is going to be absorbing food, essentially, right? It releases some hormones as it does that. That's not its main job. So here's some other places where you see endocrine function where you might not expect it. Right, so we're going to be zooming in on the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland first. Okay, so here's that mid-sagittal section. So we're looking at our brain, our brainstem. We've got this region, the hypothalamus, pinching us off down towards the pituitary stalk or infundibulum, and the pituitary gland that hangs below. Now, the pituitary gland actually has two parts that we're going to be looking at in some detail right now. So the pituitary gland is going to have an anterior lobe, so anterior towards the front, and it's going to have a posterior lobe, so posterior towards the back. And then the infundibulum, pituitary stalk, attaches it to the hypothalamus. So as we think about where our pituitary hormones come from, right, we're going to be thinking about those two parts of the pituitary gland. So first, we're going to think about the posterior part of the pituitary, right? It's because it's actually kind of the easier part of the pituitary. Okay. So when we say something is a neurohormone, we mean it's a hormone that gets secreted by a neuron rather than glandular tissue, right? Right? So this means you actually have a neuron, a nerve cell, and what it's releasing gets into the bloodstream, swims out and around, and acts as a hormone, having effects on other cells far away from that neuron itself, right? So we have two neurohormones, two peptide hormones that are going to be released from the posterior pituitary. So we can see the arrangement of what's going on here, right? So we have a neuron here in the hypothalamus, right? So we're up in the hypothalamus. We can see its axon extends down through that infundibulum. And the axon terminals of this neuron are touching our bloodstream, which is where they're going to release those neurohormones. Okay, so that's the physical arrangement, the anatomy of this situation. Right. So the two hormones, the neurohormones that get released this way, are antidiuretic hormone, which we'll talk about extensively when we talk about kidneys. It's often abbreviated ADH, okay? Also sometimes called vasopressin, targets the kidney. And its job is to increase blood volume and blood pressure by filling that blood with more water. So it increases water reabsorption. Our other neurohormone released here by the posterior pituitary. So again, we've got our neuron extending into the posterior part of our pituitary gland, those axon terminals touching our bloodstream. Oxytocin gets released by the posterior pituitary. So the function here is sometimes referred to as love, lust, and labor. It has a really complicated role in the brain and in the body, but generally involving social bonding and increases in social bonding. So involved in the sexual response in all genders, but also with breastfeeding and with uterine contractions during labor. So it does more things than you might expect. All right, but that's that love hormone. Okay, so both of these two, posterior pituitary, released directly from those neurons extending out of the hypothalamus down into the posterior pituitary. Anterior pituitary gets a bit more tricky, and we're going to see a lot more hormones here, okay? So the first thing that we want to define when we're thinking about the anterior pituitary is a tropic hormone. So when we think about a tropic hormone, we're going to be thinking about basically like levels of hormone or hormone dominance. So a tropic hormone is one that its job when it goes out in the body is to go control the release of some other hormone, right? So you're not done when you release a tropic hormone. You've just told the body to go release a second hormone that is then going to go have an effect somewhere in the body, okay? And this is what's going to be happening with a lot of the hormones when we look at our hypothalamus and our anterior pituitary, the relationship here. Okay. Now, those tropic hormones, that effect can be stimulating or inhibiting. So the effect of that tropic hormone could say, okay, go release more of hormone 2, or it could be go release less of hormone 2. The direction doesn't matter so much as that regulation. It's regulating the release of the second hormone. Okay. So this is related to the anterior pituitary because partially the shape of this whole process is different. All right. So when we're looking at the anterior pituitary, up here in the hypothalamus, we've got our nice little neurons, our neurosecretory cells. Now they're labeled here. But you can see here, this one I've just circled, the whole thing, that whole cell is pretty much staying entirely within the hypothalamus, right? So what you see happening here is that you have a cell up in the hypothalamus. It releases its secretions, right? These neurohormones are being released into the bloodstream. I'm trying to pick a color that'll show up here. You can see those little dots here being released from that cell in the hypothalamus. It's getting into this first capillary bed, so part of your bloodstream, going down through the infundibulum or that pituitary stalk. You can see we still have a little hormone traveling in the bloodstream. Then you can see in the anterior pituitary, we have a second capillary bed, okay? And then we have endocrine cells in the anterior pituitary that are responding to that signal from the hypothalamus by releasing their own hormones, okay? So this situation, this pathway, this sort of domino effect of hormones is different than we saw in the posterior pituitary, where you just essentially had a neuron going all the way from the hypothalamus, releasing its neurohormones out into the bloodstream in the posterior pituitary. Now we have our nervous system cell staying in the hypothalamus, putting its hormone into the bloodstream capillary bed there. We've got a big portal vein That portal vein is just that one singular vein linking these two capillary beds. And then we have a second endocrine cell essentially responding and releasing a hormone here in the anterior pituitary. This is not the only time we'll see a portal system, which is why we're defining it out here. Right? So a portal system is really where you have a linkage between two or more capillary beds. We're going to see that capillary beds, these smallest kind of parts of our vasculature, are where you have exchange between what's in your blood and what's in your tissue. So that's where you're going to see things crossing, essentially, coming out of the blood and affecting cells, or coming out of the cells and getting into the blood. Right? So in a portal system, you have two capillary beds and there's like a link between them. Okay? So we have a portal system here between the hypothalamus capillary bed and then that capillary bed in the anterior pituitary. So to make sure that we can select an example of a tropic hormone, now that we've mentioned the definition here, take a look at these descriptions and pick which of these you think would count as tropic hormones. Okay, take another couple of seconds if you're ready to answer. Let's take a look. Okay, cool. All right, so the first answer is the correct one and the only correct one, because our tropic hormones, they have a regulatory effect, and what they regulate specifically is the release of another hormone. So in this example, this first one, correct answer, we have gonadotropin releasing hormone. That's the name of a single hormone, regulating how much luteinizing hormone, that's a second hormone, gets released. Right? So that's what it means to say something is a tropic hormone. We have one hormone regulating another hormone. Our other two examples are things that we might consider hormones and do involve regulation. But here, what we're regulating is not another hormone, it's some effect. So here in the estrogen example, we're regulating development of female secondary sexual characteristics, not regulating another hormone. Norepinephrine regulates. In this example, it's regulating blood pressure, not regulating a hormone. So they still do stuff, but they're not tropic hormones because the stuff they're doing is not regulating a hormone. Cool. All right. So when we look at the hypothalamic pituitary portal system, which we just traced through on this same picture before, what we're looking at is we have neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus releasing tropic hormones. Those tropic hormones get into the capillary beds in the hypothalamus, then go through the portal vein, right? They're coming from the hypothalamus, so we're calling them hypothalamic tropic hormones, those blue dots, right? They're going to access the anterior pituitary secretory cells, symbolized here by that endocrine cell at the bottom, by getting there through that secondary capillary bed as part of this portal system. So then the hormone that comes from the anterior pituitary itself is being secreted by that endocrine cell in the anterior pituitary. It gets into the bloodstream on its own and then goes out to the rest of the body. Now, most of our hormones coming from the anterior pituitary gland are themselves tropic hormones that are going to go out to other glands throughout your body and trigger the release of a third hormone. So we can have multiple levels of domino kind of flowing here. So they're going to go travel to distant endocrine glands and trigger the release of additional hormones. So this is what it looks like in physical space. And later on, we will see a map of all of the kind of pathways, the specific hormones involved. Before we do that, just know that there are things controlling the hypothalamus as well. Some of that is neural input from your brain. Some of it is hormonal input in the form of negative feedback from glands out in your body. And some of it has to do with your circadian rhythm. So your like sleeping versus waking rhythm coming from a different part of the hypothalamus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Okay. So next time we'll pick up looking at some of these maps and this big map of all of our anterior pituitary hormones and hypothalamic trophic hormones. So I'll incorporate that into a worksheet and some questions for you to sort through, because me reading out this list to you is going to be yawn inducing.